Alrighty, it's that time again. Today we're gonna have a look at the newly announced balance changes to the multiplayer version of StarCraft 2, and of course I will try and give you my perspective as well. Hey everyone! Over the past few months, we've been tracking tournament results and following discussions around the TVP and ZVP matchups, and the strength of Protoss in general. What we've seen from tournaments tells a somewhat mixed story. Overall, global tournament win rates have remained close, with Protoss even arguably underperforming the WCS circuit. At the same time, however, the most recent offline Korean leagues have seen unusually high Protoss representation. For a while, for those of you unfamiliar, it was said that Protoss is way too powerful and every other race is literally unplayable. I mean, I've been in the StarCraft community for a long time, and these kind of rumors go around pretty much every couple of months. Once it's Protoss, then it's Zerg, and then the next time it's going to be Terran again. So it flips and flops all over the place. But there's no denying, though, that in the most recent GSL Code S, Protoss was doing incredibly well. And for a while, it looked like we might even have like 8 Protoss players in the top 8, which obviously would be absolutely ridiculous. Now, I guess it's a bit of a mixed bag, though, because in the end, it was Dark who ended up winning the whole thing, and Dark, of course, is a Zerg player. Anyways, while the results might paint a picture of Protoss' strength, we don't believe they tell the whole story. Rather, what we find more concerning and what we are focusing on for our next update is how players view and talk about the Protoss matchups. In both TVP and ZVP, discussions seem to boil down to how binary either matchup feels. In TVP, while tank timing pushes feel strong, Terrans say they feel disadvantaged as the game progresses. In ZVP, while Zerg players struggle with scouting and responding to Protoss' various openings, professional level Protoss players often give feedback that they are the ones who are disadvantaged in the late game. It's almost as if pro gamers are a little bit biased towards their own race, right? It's insane. As a general rule, we believe that it's perfectly healthy and even desirable that certain races have advantages over the others at different stages of the game. In a designer's ideal world, all races would have different types of advantages at all stages, like, for example, direct army strength, harass potential, etc. The concern in the current metagame comes when players feel like there's a clearly identifiable point early in the game when the advantage swaps from one race to the other, and the race that perceives themselves at the disadvantage feels they have insufficient options to disrupt this outcome. With these principles in mind, we'd like to test some changes on the testing tab to gather feedback for an upcoming balance update. This time, we'll be trying something new as we plan to release 2 sets of changes for testing. We believe both sets could result in positive improvements, but as they alter different aspects of the game, we're interested in your feedback before we determine what the best options are. The first and more experimental set of changes will be available tomorrow, so that's going to be at the time if you watch this video. And the second set of changes will be available for testing on the week of July 15th, so that is in about 2 weeks from now. Alrighty, so these are the more experimental changes. I already read through these, and I gotta be honest with you, they actually look very, very good. Anyways, first and foremost, we have one that is a little bit controversial, and that might upset a couple of players out there. I'll try and see if I can address it. So first off, we have the Terran Changes. Stimpack upgrade research duration decreased from 121 seconds to 100, meaning that you can get Stimpack out 21 seconds faster, and I would argue that Stimpack is probably the best upgrade, period, in the whole game, right? I think so. Anyways, in Early Wings of Liberty, we increased the research time of Stimpack in order to temper the strength of 3-Rex openers in TVP, which at the time was difficult for Protoss players to defend against, especially at lower levels. Fast forward to today, where the addition of adepts and shield batteries along with the changes to stalkers and starting economy have drastically altered the build's dynamics. That said, a common complaint in TVP is Terran's difficulty in punishing a fast Protoss third, and we believe a revert to this change could help to address it by creating new openers that Protoss will have to account for, allowing Terran to more seamlessly transition from tech-based openers to a bio-based mid-game, and perhaps most importantly, reducing the window in which the upgrade can be sniped. Our concerns surrounding this change revolve overly increasing the power of 2-base tank all-ins in TVP as a side effect, and overly impacting TVZ, partly by effectively speeding up the timing at which combat shields come online. Alrighty, so there's a whole lot of changes here, right? There's a whole lot of implications for a Stimpack buff. So this will certainly make a bunch of new openers viable once again in Terran versus Protoss. I'm not entirely sure if we're going to be seeing a whole lot of 3-Rex openers. I mean, those used to be common back in the day, but as they already pointed out, there are a lot of additions that have been made to the game since Wings of Liberty. I mean, it's been like 8 years, right, since that one ended, or maybe like, it's been a long time anyways. But regardless, I don't think 3-Rex openers are going to be necessarily that strong. I do think that there are going to be some timing attacks, like for example, the tank marine timing pushes that might become a little bit more potent. But for the most part, a lot of the timing pushes that Terran does with Stimpack are limited not so much by Stimpack, but by Medivacs. So for example, right, if we're talking about like the 16 marine drop in the Zerg versus Terran matchup, I've seen a lot of Zerg players freaking out over this change. Right now, Zerg, generally speaking, has to defend 16 Marines with Stimpack and 2 Medivacs right around 5 minutes and 10 seconds. And usually what you can do is just simply start producing Zerglings around 4.5 minutes and defend with Lings and Queens. However, with this change, you would imagine, well, Stimpack is gonna be finished 21 seconds earlier. That means that obviously that push will also hit significantly quicker. The thing is, that's not really the case. For the most part, a lot of those timing attacks are actually based around the Medivac. You need to have the Medivacs out in order to send the units across fast enough, and more often than not, the pushes are limited not so much by the Stimpack upgrade, but by the Medivac. I do think, however, that this will open up some new potential for Terran pushes, like for example, Hellbat Stimpack pushes already are rather common, not as common as maybe some of the other builds right now, but I do think Hellbat Stimpack pushes might be really nice, and then maybe a transition towards a bio mid-game. There's a bunch of builds that might be viable because of this, and I actually really look forward to seeing how this plays out. I think it's actually really cool. Obviously, it might be a little bit too much. They could always make it so it's going to be like 110 seconds rather than 100. But overall, I'm actually really looking forward to seeing how this plays out, because I don't think it's going to be as big of a deal as a lot of people make it sound to be. And yeah, I think there's only really a whole lot of upsides, especially when it comes to like punishing Protoss third bases. As it is right now, a lot of Protoss players go for a pretty quick third base. And since Terrans can't really punish it very easily, it's very difficult to actually prevent it from happening. So you are essentially forced as a Terran to also build your third command center and go for a push a little while later. I think this will open up like a wide array of new pushes, and I think Protoss and Zerg players will adjust just fine, right? Especially Zerg players, they will adjust just fine. It's going to maybe be a little bit trickier for Protoss. Maybe they're going to have to delay the third base, but I guess that alone will already be the result that they're looking for. So I really like this change. Here's one, though, that I think is a little bit more experimental. A new upgrade, Enhanced Shockwaves. Increases the radius of the Ghost EMP round from 1.5 to 2. Cost is 150 minerals and 150 gas, and the research time is 79 seconds. We receive a lot of feedback on why TVP is perceived to favor Protoss in the late game, and a constant throughout is the raw direct strength of the late game Protoss army. We believe the proposed change will not only help Terrans in direct engagements, but also shift the age-old zoning relation between Ghost and Templar a bit more in the Ghost favor. A bit more? Alright, we'll talk about that in a sec. Our decision to try this change out as an upgrade instead of a baked-in improvement stems from not wanting to impact the strength of 3-base Terran all-ins in TVP or Templar-based mid-games. Even as an upgrade, we'll be monitoring the effects of this change closely, as it would also impact TVZ, a matchup where Ghosts are already perceived to be more powerful or a very powerful late-game unit. Alright. So this is definitely a bit more of an experimental one. 150 minerals and 150 gas is not cheap, which means that you will, generally speaking, really only get this towards like the mid to late game and maybe even after that. So I don't really see timing attacks where this is going to be very good. However, someone did the math, and an increase from 1.5 to 2 will actually be a flat out 77% increase in the radius. That's huge, right? Already EMP is a pretty large spell. Right now it's gonna be it's gonna have 77% more service area. Now, I think the main concern here is the Terran versus Zerg and the Terran versus Protoss matchup. In Terran versus Zerg with Infestors, since the EMP removes the energy out of Infestors, and in Terran versus Protoss, obviously it will not only remove the energy out of High Templar, but also on the rest of the Protoss army's shields. I think this might be a little bit too strong, especially in TVZ. Maybe I'm biased because I'm a Zerg player at heart, as you guys know. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, so I do want to say that, but I do feel like already the Ghost is kind of like the best late game unit Terran has in the Terran versus Zerg matchup. So they deal really well with Infestors already, with EMPs. Maybe a little bit too weak there, but I'm not entirely sure there. But already Ghosts are really good when it comes to EMPing Vipers, EMPing Infestors, sniping Ultralisk, and sniping Brute Lords. They kind of deal with the whole late game Zerg army extremely well. So I'm a little bit worried that this is just going to make them even more powerful. But regardless, if this is primarily meant to fix the TVP situation, I think this might be a good change, but it might just be a little bit too much. In the late game, Terran has a lot of resources available anyways, and 150 at that point is certainly something you can easily spend. And a 77% or 77% increase in the radius sounds extremely good. We'll have to see how this one plays out in the game, but I'm a little bit more hesitant on this one right here. All right, next, we have a nerf right here to the Zerg. Infested Terran's rocket damage decreased from 14 to 12. The feedback we've received... Okay, hold up. The feedback we've received surrounding Zerg's perceived late-game advantage in ZVP centers a lot around the Infested Terrans and their ability to fight interceptors. As part of patch 4.0, we gave Infested Terrans a more powerful anti-air weapon precisely for this purpose, but after the carrier changes last year, we'd like to adjust the power of the Infested Terran accordingly. After this change, it'll take an additional shot for an Infested Terran to kill an interceptor at most upgrades level. And I also want to go ahead and read the next one real quick. So the carrier interceptor build time decreased from 11 to 9. For similar reasons as above, we'd like to scale back the increase to the interceptor's build time from last year's post-BlizzCon patch. Combined with the Infested Terran change, we'll keep an eye out on how much the needle will move in terms of Protoss' ability to fight Zerg in the late game. Alright, so I think both of these changes kind of need to go together. Here's the thing. When it comes to proper anti-air, Zerg obviously has the Queen, the Hydralisk, the Corruptor, and I think the best one is indeed the Infested Terran, right? Obviously, that's like Parasitic Bomb, Fungal Growth, those kind of things as well. But as far as like straight up units go, I think those are the ones that we have to think about most of the time. And it really comes down to the fact that the Infested Terran is just simply the best one. They're easy to spam, they're very, very sustainable, and they deal more damage than any of those other units that I just mentioned. Plus, Infestors have a lot more use in the late game as well. They can obviously Neuroparasite and Fungal Growth as well. Infested Terrans just simply are the way to go right now when it comes to dealing with a late game army. The thing is, there's once again the dynamic, and I feel like a lot of the mid to late game pushes and the late game in general, a lot of the mid to late game and the mid game are all based around the High Templar. So in TVP, we obviously have that dynamic between the High Templar and the Ghost. Then in Zerg versus Protoss, obviously, we know that the High Templar is very, very good as well. However, in the late game, generally speaking, what we see is Infested Terrans going up against Psionic Storm. So what happens is not so much that the Infested Terrans are really, really good, because they're good if they manage to stay alive, but if they get stormed, obviously, to death, they will be picked off. The thing is, usually Infested Terrans aren't useful until the energy of the High Templar is gone, right? So even if you reduce the damage here by 2, I don't think it's really going to affect things too much, because they absolutely shred through all of those interceptors super quickly. I mean, yeah, it's going to take them an additional shot, but if anything, that's probably going to just make Zerg players get more Infestors, because it's still, for all intents and purposes, the best late game Zerg anti-air. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe a better change is addressing one of the core units that can actually deal with air units. But yeah, I mean, obviously buffing a Hydralisk or a Corruptor would absolutely break the game in every other aspect. So I don't really see this change right here to the Infested Terrans being that impactful, because it really only is useful once the High Templar are out of energy, and at that point they absolutely shred everything. So yeah, you can reduce their damage a little bit, and maybe it's gonna affect things a bit, but I don't think it's gonna be that huge. By the way, for those of you unfamiliar, a lot of the top-level Zerg versus Protoss games right now are extremely favored in the late game for Zerg. Just like many others, I, as a Zerg player, absolutely suck against dealing with Protoss in the late game. I'm not very good at it. It's very difficult. But yeah, the top-level Zerg players make it look extremely easy. They just deal with the late-game Protoss army like it's just made out of butter. and they just have like a hot knife and they just absolutely, you know, shred it to pieces. So that's the reason why the Protoss carrier is indeed being buffed up here a little bit as well. One of the things is that once the Infested Terrans disappear, or rather once the Interceptors disappear, it takes Protoss a very long time to rebuild, right? So they have to build 8 Interceptors, and they take 11 seconds each, meaning that it takes them like a minute and a half to go back up to the full Interceptor count. With this change right here, it's going to take them more like a minute and 10 or a minute and 12-ish seconds. It's still going to be a while, but they will rebuild faster. So I actually quite like these two changes here. This should be a more interesting dynamic, and at the very least, a less Zerg favorite. All right, here's another one. Nexus Strategic Recall, which is the recall on the units that a lot of Protoss players like to use in the early game, increased from 85 to 130 seconds. While it's cool that Protoss can utilize Strategic Recall to position their armies between their bases, we believe they can currently do so too frequently. This change is intended to more punish Protoss players who are consistently out of position against multi-pronged harass. Yeah, I'm not sure about this change. I have never really noticed, oh my god, Protoss is recalling again, that's ridiculous. It's like, no, I actually never really minded it too much. Once again, might be a little bit of Zerg bias there, because I don't see the Terran versus Protoss matchup as frequently myself. Obviously, this is going to help out against like Medivac drops and all that, but I feel like most of the top level Protoss players have units ready to deal with all of that anyways. So I guess it's really just going to punish Protoss players on the ladder, especially when they do not have units in different spots and just sort of ball everything together. Shouldn't really affect the high level gameplay all too much. All right. Now, arguably the biggest change. I know the Stimpack one is huge, right? But let's talk about the biggest change. So I've said it over the last couple of weeks. I think the Warp Prism is the best unit in the game, period. I don't think anything really comes close. Maybe the Queen, but the Warp Prism, it's become a unit that Protoss players at the highest level have just gotten so much value out of. And right now, it's kind of trickling down the ladder. I see a lot of like, even like Master 2 level players showcasing some ridiculously good Warp Prism control, and it's very difficult to beat. I do think the Warp Prism is a little bit too strong. I don't know if it's the pickup radius. I don't know if it's the warp-in speed. I don't know if it's the unit costing a little bit too little. It's a variety of aspects, I'm sure. But let's read the changes that Blizzard has come up with. And I actually really like these. So the Warp Prism no longer starts with the Warp Conduit passive ability, and warp-ins will take 11 seconds when not near a warp gate or nexus, up from 4. The Graphitic Drive upgrade, which is an upgrade that Protoss players may have heard of at some point, but not a lot of people get, now has the additional functionality of granting Warp Prisms the Warp Conduit passive ability, reducing warp-in time from 11 to 4. So Graphitic Drive, by the way, is the upgrade that allows the Warp Prism to fly significantly faster, and right now it's also going to give it the fast warping in a mechanic. I really like this change. Once again, might be a little bit Zerg biased, but I think this is actually big. What this means is that every single attack with the Warp Prism is gonna hit a little bit later, right? So as it is right now, there's a lot of... So the Warp Prism fulfills so many different functions, right? It's being used defensively, for example, with like Immortal Juggling. It's being used offensively, for example, with like Archon drops. It's being used in timing attacks as a way to reinforce the different Protoss armies. And in general, it's just got a ton of functionality in the late game with like big Zealot warpins inside of the base. It's got a ton of functionality. Now, I feel like this right here addresses a couple of the changes. First off, it addresses the timing attacks that Protoss can do off of 2 bases. So say, for example, like 8-gate Zealot all-ins, right? The dirty one, the one that a lot of Zerg players will struggle against. This is certainly going to be significantly weaker just because the push will always hit 7 seconds later initially, which is quite a lot. I mean, that might allow you to get another round of units defensively out. But it will also help out as far as like reinforcements go, right? Because it's just going to take these units longer to warp in. However, it's not so much going to address very much in the late game. It's not going to address the defensive mechanics of the Prism. You can still certainly pull off Archon juggles as well, although obviously the Archons will initially also hit a little bit later. What this will likely mean, though, is that Zerg players, for example, are going to just simply take their lairs a little while later. For example, what it means is that a lot of Zerg players right now go for about a 335-ish lair in order to beat Dark Templar when they scout that it's going to be Dark Templar based openers. Right now they will probably go for like a 340 lair, which doesn't sound very significant, but it's all minor things that will make it easier to defend the follow-up pushes and whatnot in the end as well. I really like this change. It's gonna, at the very least, force Protoss players to also think outside of the box and maybe go for some different builds again as well. And in the late game, obviously, with the gravitic drive upgrade becoming more and more common, I'm assuming at the very least, it's gonna make this a very interesting mechanic still, and it's gonna certainly not, like, throw the Warp Prism out of the window, right? A lot of the times, Zerg, or rather Blizzard, has Usually, here's the thing. Whenever we, like, read build order changes and, like, balance updates to StarCraft 2 a couple years ago, they used, like, over-nerf or over-buff units. This is a pretty subtle approach that's gonna make the Warp Prism a little bit weaker, significantly so in some areas, but it's not gonna affect the unit in any way, shape, or form in other areas, right? So I actually think this is a really cool change. I'm curious to see how this is gonna play out. And, yeah, I think it's going to be a good one. I mean, obviously, the thing is, Protoss still has a lot of different build orders as well. For example, I mean, we used to see a ton of Stargate openers. They've fallen a little bit out of fashion, although at Home Story Cup recently, they certainly did make a comeback again. We see a lot of, like, 1 Phoenix, 3 Oracle openers right now in the Zerg versus Protoss matchup. These openers will probably become more and more prevalent, and then the 2 base all-ins are gonna become a little bit less common because they're technically a bit weaker. I think this can only really bring positives, and while maybe it's gonna be a little bit much, 11 seconds is quite a long time. Maybe they have to reduce that and make it like 8 seconds, but at the very least, like, there's easy numbers to adjust here to scale it in either favor, and yeah, I really don't mind this. I think it's really cool. All right. Hold up, let me drink a little bit of water real quick. So currently the discourse surrounding ZVP seems to center primarily around the number of powerful early game Protoss openings. Okay. Not only does Protoss have a high number of tech options, they also have many variations of immortal all-ins that require different responses. Though we believe all these attacks to be theoretically defendable, the margin of error for the defender might be too low. This is key right here. The top level Zerg players once again make it look easy. However, if you're a regular run-of-the-mill Zerg player like myself, one mistake and you're dead. There are a few ways to address this, such as improving the Zerg early game scouting, or yes, so that's actually another thing that I've been talking about a lot on the live stream. For example, making Overlord speed cheaper. But anyways, or weakening some of the Protoss early game options. For the first iteration of the testing lab, however, we'd like to try a more experimental change intended to reinforce the concept of defender's advantage in all Protoss matchups. Okay, so I think then in the second experimental set of changes, they'll probably make the Overlord speed upgrade cheaper. Maybe make it like 75. Doesn't sound very significant once again, but it allows it to scout like 25 gas earlier, right? Because you can start the upgrade a little bit quicker, which will probably result in Zerg players being able to scout before the 3.5 minute mark, which means they can decide if they want to go lair first or if they go for a bunch of spore crawlers. Once again, this is all very, very minor, and it will shift the skills just a little bit, but there is a little bit more room for error, which I think is good. All right. So, defender's advantage is a tricky thing to balance in an RTS, as shifting it too much in favor of the attacker creates overly aggressive games. Meanwhile, shifting it too much in favor of the defenders results in more turtle situations. Currently, we believe PvZ is in a state where defender's advantage is not sufficient for the Zerg players in the early game, when scouting can often be limited as to a Zergling running into the Protoss army exiting their base. Because of the short response time... Okay, that's not true though. I mean, most of the Zerg scouting comes down from Overlord positioning, and Overlords in general, and then obviously seeing whether or not they're taking a base. And whether or not they're moving out as well, obviously, but that's not as significant. But anyways, because of the short response time and Protoss' fast warp-in mechanic, the sum of Zerg's defender's advantages at that point may not be enough. Another example of low defender's advantage in the PvP matchup where both sides have access to similar reinforcement time with gateway units. While the defender has better access to Stargate and robotics units reinforcements, gateway units have become more powerful over time and thus better equipped to deal with low number of high-tech units. We feel this can inhibit players from feeling safe enough to invest into establishing more bases over more units. With these changes, we believe games are more likely to pass the 3 base mark and robotics bay-based play could become more common. For all these perceived benefits, we acknowledge that this is one of the most riskiest mid-year changes we've ever proposed. Really? Oh man, I feel like it's really not that extreme, right? I mean, I remember some changes back in the day, like the bunker build time. Okay, no, not that one, but there certainly have been some crazy changes back in the day, like buffing like the queen ranged. That's a lot. Anyways, first and foremost, we're concerned that this change might be too heavy-handed and would overly nurture Protoss all-ins. And while this change more directly and obviously hurts Protoss all-ins, it also weakens macro play by both reducing the threat of potential attacks and reducing the strength of warp in harass. In PvT in particular, we also have concerns that this change could further push Protoss towards the already very popular robotics bay openers. All these changes notwithstanding, even if this change does not make the final cut, we think there is value in spurring discussion within the community. We look forward in hearing what you have to say, not only about this change, but also about the entire package proposed today. Alright, so as far as the entire package proposed today goes, I like it a lot. I think this is a step in the right direction, although there are some things that I think might be worth looking into as well. I do think, though, that this is gonna make the game a little bit more accessible. The thing is, even though Protoss is doing extremely well right now, it seems like at the highest level, they're struggling at least a little bit. Whether or not that's due to, like, the Protoss skill level or Protoss just being extremely unforgiving in the late game. I mean, one wrong move and Protoss late game is just absolutely awful, right? Abducting, for example, a mothership is a massive deal. Just being able to spray Infested Terrans everywhere, accidentally getting your army neural parasited, having one ghost EMP, everything. There's a bunch of really small mistakes that you can make in the late game that are extremely punishing, and I feel like this is especially true for Protoss. Now, there's a couple of other things that I think are worth looking into as well. For example, a charge nerf. Charge right now is extremely strong. I think it might be a little bit too much. Right now, the way it works is that once it finishes charge, the Zealot that is, it will charge forward, deal damage on impact, and then also hit twice. I feel like the dealing of the damage on impact might be a little bit too high. Secondly, I think the Nidus Worm might actually be a little bit too strong. This is a very difficult thing to adjust. The Nidus Worm is extremely popular still at the highest level of play right now. The thing is, it's very difficult to change because if you make it, like, for example, even weaker, because it's already pretty easy to deal with, but if you make it even weaker, it's very, very likely that it will just never be used again, right? That Zerg players will go back to what we used to do back in Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm and just assume the unit doesn't exist. So this is a very, very difficult thing to balance. I also think that maybe the Zerg Queen is a little bit too strong. I think the Zerg Queen is too well-rounded. It deals with everything extremely well in the early game. It's extremely helpful in the late game as well if you have some left over for transfuse. And really, it's the be-all and defend everything unit in the early game. And I think it's just maybe a little bit too much. I know some Zerg players are cringing with me saying this, but seriously, I think it's just a little bit too much. Pickup radius on the Warp Prism. I think the pickup radius on the Warp Prism is also a little bit too crazy. There's been people that have said, like, hey, maybe we should make it so that if you juggle units in the Prism, maybe they should not be able to attack for like a split second, which I think might be cool, but I kind of like the juggling as well that's possible. I do think there's some really cool potential for some really cool strategies, and yeah, it really does allow you to showcase your skills, so I don't think I agree with that, but maybe just moving the pickup radius one level down, right? I think right now, I'm not entirely sure what the number is, but just removing or reducing the number of the pickup radius by 1 would probably already be a really, really big impact then as well. And then I think that about sums it up. Yeah, so the ones, I wrote it down right here. I think the Nidus, the Prism, the Charge, and then the Queen. I think those are all things that we might want to look into as well to make the game a little bit more enjoyable. But overall, gotta say, big fan of where these changes are at. I'm curious to see where this is going to go as well in the future. So just to clarify, this is going to be available in the balanced test map, which means the players can obviously play it very easily, but it's not going to be live in the multiplayer version of the game directly. Apparently, there's going to be a second set of changes as well. So we'll have to see what those are going to be like here in the near future as well. So I think I'll probably make a follow-up video to this one in about 2 weeks. If you're new here, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you get notifications as soon as that one goes live. But other than that, I want to thank you very much so for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile alright. And I will see you once again in the next one.